Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
5:30 in the morning, Monday, April 9th, 1917. The temperature is below freezing. Sleet is driving sideways across a ravaged landscape in northern France. In the tunnels carved deep beneath Vimy Ridge, tens of thousands of young men are crouched in the dark, waiting. They've been rehearsing this assault for weeks, walking the mapped terrain, memorizing their objectives, learning their roles in a timed ballet of artillery and infantry that no Allied army has ever managed before. At precisely 5:30, the guns open up. The noise is described by survivors as something beyond description, not a sound so much as a physical force that erases all thought. And then the whistles blow. In 4 hours, the Canadians will take a ridge that the British and French had bled and failed to take for 2 years. And from that extraordinary morning, a nation will build a founding myth. Here's the thing, though. That myth, the one you've probably heard, the one that says Canada was born on that ridge, is one of the most beautifully constructed, politically useful, and historically complicated stories in the modern world. It contains a real victory. It contains genuine sacrifice. And it contains something else. A story assembled after the fact by people who needed it for reasons that had very little to do with what those soldiers actually experienced. That's what I want to explore today. Not to diminish what happened at Vimy Ridge. The bravery there was real, the cost was staggering, and the tactical achievement was extraordinary. But to understand what the battle actually meant versus what we decided it meant. Because those are two very different things. This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Today is April 9th, and on this date in 1917, the Battle of Vimy Ridge began. It's Canada's most celebrated military victory, and one of the most revealing case studies in how nations build the stories they need to survive. Ask any Canadian about Vimy Ridge, and you'll hear some version of the same sentence. That's where Canada became a nation. It's taught in schools. It's carved into monuments. Brigadier General Alexander Ross, watching the assault from behind the lines, wrote afterward, "In those few minutes, I witnessed the birth of a nation." That phrase, or some echo of it, has been repeated so often by so many politicians and historians and textbooks that it has the weight of settled fact. And the battle itself, genuinely remarkable. For 2 years, the ridge had been one of the most impenetrable German positions on the Western Front. The French had attempted to take it in 1915, suffering more than 100,000 casualties without success. The British had tried and failed. The ridge commanded the entire Douai Plain. Whoever held it held a strategic advantage that neither side could afford to ignore. When the 4 divisions of the Canadian Expeditionary Force were assigned the assault, most military planners expected another bloodbath. What they got instead was something close to a masterpiece. The Canadians rehearsed over a full-scale model of the ridge. They developed a creeping barrage, artillery fire that moved forward in precise increments, with infantry following directly behind it. Each soldier was given a specific objective, a specific time to reach it, a map of exactly where he needed to be. Nothing like this level of distributed responsibility had been standard in Allied doctrine. By noon on April 9th, the Canadians controlled the ridge. By April 12th, they held the entire position. The cost, roughly 11,000 casualties, nearly 3,600 dead. But they had done what no one else had managed to do. That's the story, and it's all true. Now here's where it gets complicated. The phrase all four Canadian divisions fighting together for the first time is technically accurate, and it matters. It was the largest coordinated Canadian military effort to that point. But when you look at who was actually in those divisions, the picture of a unified Canadian national identity starts to blur at the edges. Nearly half the soldiers in the Canadian Corps, roughly 49%, were not Canadian-born. They were first-generation British immigrants who had come to Canada in the decade before the war, many of them with deep ties to Britain, many of them fighting precisely because they felt loyalty to the Empire rather than to a new Canadian identity. For some of them, Vimy was the moment they began to feel Canadian. For others, they were fighting for a country they had left behind. And the commander who masterminded the assault wasn't Canadian at all. Lieutenant General Julian Byng was British. He had taken command of a demoralized Canadian Corps after its disastrous performance at the St. Eloi craters, rebuilt its officer corps from the ground up, and designed the training methodology that made the Vimy assault possible. Major General Arthur Currie, the Canadian commander who would later take over the Corps and become the genuine article of Canadian military leadership, was at Vimy, but it was Byng's battle. Currie himself, years later, was skeptical of Vimy's elevation above other Canadian engagements. He believed the Corps had performed as well or better elsewhere. The birth of a nation framing, he felt, wasn't quite right. Even the battle's place in the broader war gets distorted by the Canadian nationalist lens. For everyone outside Canada, April 9th, 1917 was day one of the Battle of Arras, a 5-week Allied offensive that ultimately failed to achieve its main objectives and left Allied hopes for ending the war that summer in ruins. The Canadians succeeded brilliantly in their portion of it, but the Globe and Mail's front page the following day didn't trumpet the birth of a nation. It credited overall British commander Douglas Haig. The birth metaphor grew later, slowly, assembled by writers and politicians who needed it. I find myself drawn to a particular kind of evidence in history, not the official proclamations, not the commemorative speeches, but the words of the people who were actually there, speaking before they knew what their experience would be made to mean. One veteran of Vimy Ridge, Frank Frederick Strange, was asked years later about the battle. He had served there. He knew what that morning was. His response, "We were not heroes, we were victims." That's not cynicism. That's a man who watched thousands of his comrades die in freezing mud and didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like someone who had survived something terrible. The nation-building narrative asks him to be a stepping stone in Canada's constitutional story. He's telling you it felt like something else entirely. Then there are the Canadians who weren't at Vimy at all, and why they weren't matters enormously. Quebec, French-speaking Canada, was dramatically underrepresented in the Canadian Corps. For reasons that were real and legitimate, many French Canadians felt little connection to the British Empire, had been promised by Henri Bourassa's nationalist movement that Canadian boys would not be sent to fight British wars, and had watched the war's early years with growing alienation from the English-Canadian leadership that ran the Corps. By 1917, Canada was in the grip of a bitter conscription crisis that would leave scars lasting generations. And here's where the Vimy myth becomes politically explosive. Prime Minister Robert Borden attended the Imperial War Conference just days after the battle and used the victory to argue that Canada deserved greater autonomy within the empire, a real constitutional gain. But back home, the victory was also weaponized. Members of Parliament cited Vimy to shame Quebec into accepting conscription. Look what our soldiers accomplished. Are you going to quit now? The battle that supposedly unified a nation was being used in the same breath to divide it. The birth of a nation, it turns out, wasn't a birth experienced equally. What's striking to historians who look carefully at the Vimy story is how late the nation-building mythology actually crystallized. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the language of national birth was barely present. It emerged slowly over the following decades, shaped by poets, journalists, politicians, and educators who recognized in Vimy a story that Canada needed. And that's not necessarily a cynical thing. There's nothing dishonest about a nation finding meaning in a moment of genuine sacrifice and genuine achievement. Every nation does this. The question is always, what gets included in the story and what gets quietly set aside? What got set aside at Vimy was Quebec, the conscription crisis, the British officers and British immigrants who made up half the Corps, the fact that the assault was part of a larger offensive that failed, Arthur Curry's own doubts, and the 3,600 men who didn't come home and never got to decide what their deaths were supposed to mean. What got kept was the imagery of young men from across a vast, diverse country standing together and doing something extraordinary. And that image is powerful because there's real truth in it. It just isn't the only truth. Historian Tim Cook, one of Canada's most rigorous chroniclers of the First World War, has spent years peeling back the layers of the Vimy myth while still taking the battle seriously on its own terms. His argument, roughly, the myth isn't false, but it's selective, and the selection has shaped Canadian national consciousness in ways both constructive and limiting. When a nation builds its identity on military sacrifice, what does that do to how it thinks about itself? What stories can't be told within that framework? We're living in a moment when societies around the world are arguing about exactly this: the relationship between the founding stories nations tell themselves and the people those stories leave out. Statues come down. Curricula get revised. People fight ferociously, sometimes literally, about what gets commemorated and how. Vimy Ridge sits right at the center of that argument, in a way that's actually more useful than most because it isn't a story about villains. Nobody at Vimy was doing something shameful. The soldiers were brave. The tactics were innovative. The sacrifice was real. And yet, the story built around it still managed to erase certain Canadians, to weaponize grief for political purposes, and to paper over the cracks in a society that was far more fractured than the myth acknowledges. The question Vimy poses isn't, was it wrong? The question is subtler. What is a nation actually built from? Is it a single moment, a ridge taken in sleet and cold, in 4 extraordinary hours? Or is it the accumulated work of generations of farmers, teachers, immigrants, nurses, and ordinary people who never fired a shot? And if both are true, and they are, then what do we lose when we reduce the answer to a battlefield? Historian Desmond Morton once wrote that, as Renan had foreseen, Canadians had shaped a nation at Vimy, invoking the 19th century French philosopher's idea that nations are made by doing great things together. But the same Ernest Renan also wrote something else, less often quoted, that a nation requires not only shared memory, but shared forgetting. There are things a nation must agree not to dwell on if the myth is going to hold. I think about that a lot when I look at Vimy. The story held. It held for a century. It gave Canada something to stand on in the years when it was trying to figure out what it was. And it cost something. Not a betrayal, nothing so dramatic. Just the weight of everything that had to be set aside for the image to remain clean. Both things are true. The sacrifice was real, and the mythology was constructed. The victory was genuinely Canadian, and the birth of a nation was a story told after the fact by people who needed it. The battle united some Canadians and divided others, sometimes the same people, at the same moment, depending on where they stood. That's what Monday, April 9th, 1917 actually was. Not simpler than the myth, but richer. Not less inspiring, but more honest. The philosopher Benedict Anderson famously described nations as imagined communities, not because they aren't real, but because the bonds between millions of strangers who will never meet each other require an act of collective imagination to sustain. Myths, monuments, commemorations, these are the infrastructure of that imagination. Vimy Ridge is an extraordinary infrastructure. It gave Canada a story it could believe in, at a moment when it desperately needed one. The fact that the story was partly assembled, partly selective, partly weaponized, that doesn't make it less Canadian. It makes it completely human. Every nation does this. The only question is whether we're honest enough to look at the gaps. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, I'd leave you with a few questions worth sitting with. When does a nation's founding story become more important than the full truth of what happened? What do the people left out of a national myth owe to that myth? And what does it owe to them? And if you had been in that tunnel on Monday, 1917, waiting in the dark and the cold, what would you have wanted your sacrifice to mean? Because that's what Vimy teaches us. Not just about Canada, but about how all of us need our stories to be bigger. Vimy, the complicated, painful, magnificent reality of what we actually live through. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, I have a small favor to ask. Please take just a moment to leave a comment or a quick review wherever you listen. It sounds like a small thing, but it genuinely matters for the algorithm, and it helps new listeners find the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell a friend. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.